Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this session. My name is Marion Crow. I'm a visiting scholar in the program of Liberal Studies here at Notre Dame, and I'm happy to introduce our speaker for today. Lucy Beckett is from England. She studied at the University of Cambridge, where she earned an MA in history. She married young, has 4 children and 6 grandchildren, worked for more than 25 years as a teacher, and has always read and studied widely. She and her husband, the musicologist John Warwick, live close to the ruins of Rievaulx Abbey, one of the great Cistercian monasteries of northern England. In 1981, she began teaching at Ampleforth College, the Benedictine school in Yorkshire run by the monks of Ampleforth Abbey. She taught English, Latin, and history, and ran the school theater for 6 years. When she retired from the school in 1996, she continued for 5 years to teach Latin and church history to the novices and juniors in the monastic community. She has written a number of books: Wallace Stevens, Richard Wagner's Parsifal, Richard Wagner, right? A book on York Minster, A Pilgrim Guide to the Cistercian Abbeys of North Yorkshire, The Returning Wave, a collection of poems, The Time Before You Die, a novel about the Reformation, and In the Light of Christ, In the Life of Christ, Writings in the Western Tradition, a major study of more than 30 authors from Plato to Czesław Miłosz in relation to Christian truth and the history of Christianity. Her most recent book, A Postcard from the Volcano, a novel set in Weimar, Germany, was published in 2009. Lucy Beckett has broadcast for the BBC on a variety of literary, musical, and theological topics. She is a regular reviewer of theological and historical books for the Times Literary Supplement and has written many reviews and articles for The Tablet, Priests and People, The Church Times, and International Record Review. Her talk this afternoon is entitled Tragedy as the Unconcealment of Being, a Literary Reflection on Sacrifice and the Common Good. Lucy Beckett.
Thank you very much. You will have gathered from all that I am not and never have been a proper academic, which means I'm particularly grateful to have been invited to come to this fantastic conference and to read a paper. It also means, having picked up a few bits of subtext in the last couple of days, that I feel 25 years of teaching boys in school was rather a quiet life. This paper will suggest, if anyone can't hear me, by the way, will you make a fuss, stick a hand up for something and we will adjust the system. This paper will suggest that there are 2, and in the end only 2, coherent ways of reading, that's to say, receiving and understanding the great works by common consent defined as tragedies. Either the tragedy, the spectacle of one suffering into acknowledgement of the truth, is played out against a transcendent horizon, a horizon that may be described as divine justice, the judgment of God, or it is not. Either the transcendent horizon gives a meaning that is redemptive to the suffering, usually the death, of the central character, or there is no such meaning, so that suffering and death are no more than broken bits in the random waste heap of human misery. This is a narrowing and sharpening to focus on a particular kind of work of art, of the contrast between the view that all human life is played out against a transcendent horizon, or it is, in Macbeth's despairing description, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. We're familiar with the contrast. In tragedy, a kind of work of art which at a deep level engages our sympathy and our anxiety, our pity and terror, as Aristotle put it. The contrast is felt with an acuteness that can make the study of tragedy especially instructive. The question to be asked of tragedy as of life is whether conscience is in reality the voice of God in us, which we may choose to hear or to ignore. Is it, in the words of Pope Benedict, not a principle of arbitrariness, but rather an expression of faith in the secret co-knowing of man with the truth? Or is it a mere illusion, foisted on us by what Nietzsche, describing truth, called, quote, a mobile army of metaphors, metonymics, anthropomorphisms, a famine short of human relationships which rhetorically and poetically intensified, ornamented and transformed, come to be thought of after long usage by a people as fixed, binding and canonical. Nietzsche reckoned that he personally had wiped away the transcendent horizon. And he was right in his deduction that if it's no longer there, then tragedy, like all art, floats free of objective meaning, displaying only the anguish of unredeemable human misery in the face of significance-cancelling death. If this is indeed the case, then accounting for the hold great tragedy has on our imagination and memory becomes difficult. Thus only the perverse exhilaration of some kind of schadenfreude lie behind our loyalty to the tragic masterpieces. Or does, as Nietzsche thought, the celebratory collision of the Dionysian with the Apollonian in a triumphant work of art satisfy only our aesthetic sense? Do we, in his words, possess art lest we perish of the truth? This fierce splitting of the beautiful from the true and of either from the good was for him axiomatic. For a philosopher to say the good and the beautiful and the true are one is infamy, he wrote. For a philosopher to say the good and the beautiful are one is infamy. And he went on, if he goes on to say also the true, one ought to thrash him. I quoted Nietzsche at some length because of his uncompromising clarity, and also because he presides over the ways in which tragedy has been discussed in the secular academy for a good 100 years. The contrasting view of tragedy as of all human life is Christian, is in the end Catholic, and if it is to be thoroughly worked through in proper philosophical fashion, ultimately Thomist. In Alistair MacIntyre's three rival versions of moral inquiry, the Nietzschean, or genealogical as MacIntyre calls it after Nietzsche's genealogy of morals, and the Thomist approaches are precisely analysed and contrasted. The third version of moral inquiry, by the way, in case anyone hasn't read that book, I expect everyone has, was the Enlightenment's assumption of progress towards a universal rational consensus. This turned out to be a chimera. One of MacIntyre's most striking observations is the dependence of the Nietzschean view on, quote, that which it aspires to overcome. It draws, he says, surely accurately, its necessary sustenance from that which it professes to have discarded. If the raison d'etre of a particular view is its negation of a positive, the presence of the positive will lurk in its very existence. But this is not a philosophical paper, and I'm not a philosopher, and my tentative look at what a Christian can nowadays make of the great tragedies will use only more general, theological and literary language in reference. To begin, then, at the beginning, with the great tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, and leaving Euripides to one side of this discussion, because his works are more mixed, more equivocal as to the transcendent horizon because of what had happened in the city of Athens while he was writing, and also because through the gory horrors of Seneca's tragedies, Euripides was indirectly familiar for many centuries when Aeschylus and Sophocles were unknown in the Latin world. only Antigone was translated into modern languages in the early modern period, and no play by Aeschylus was translated into English until the 19th century. This millennium and a half of ignorance is important, because when Aeschylus' and Sophocles' plays properly entered the consciousness of the West, the Enlightenment welcomed them as splendidly pagan, Greek rather than Roman, untainted by what Nietzsche regarded as the whole disastrous, God-infected tradition initiated by Plato. This made it possible for him and his many followers to celebrate the raw, death-devoted vitality of the plays in the manner I've outlined, and for some to decide that such a thing as Christian tragedy must be generically impossible, so that Shakespeare's tragedies are either not Christian or not properly described as tragedies. This is practically universal in England. It may not be so universal in this country. If, however, a Christian allows himself to read, or much better watch, a Greek tragedy, with his imagination open to the possibility that the play moves us as it does, because its truth and beauty have to do with the truth and beauty of God, then the resonances that echo in it will have a profoundly recognizable meaning. As Nicholas Lash recently wrote about Conrad's Heart of Darkness, quote, "The failure to read the story theologically is due, at least in part, to the assumption that the subject matter of theology is religion, rather than all things whatsoever in relation to the mystery of God, their origin and end." I think we had a similar kind of view of the films of Ingmar Bergman last night. In the three plays of Aeschylus' Oresteia, particularly in the last, the Eumenides, there's much that will strike a Christian as astonishingly similar, parallel, let's say, to situations and disclosures with which he's familiar. At the end of the Eumenides, the sequence of murder, guilt, revenge, and suffering that began with the original sin of Paris and Helen is halted and brought to a positive conclusion by the intervention of divine justice and mercy. It's the goddess Athene, goddess of wisdom and of the city for which the plays were written, who achieves this resolution of sin and suffering. Orestes, guilty of murdering his mother, herself guilty of murdering his father, who in turn was guilty of sacrificing their daughter for a favourable wind, has been tracked down by the Furies. Athene tames the Furies, peace is restored, and the play ends with a great procession, the now friendly Furies, led by the goddess, celebrating hope, reconciliation, and resolve for the future peace of the family battered by the blows of divine justice. This, for the city, was a liturgical moment against a transcendent horizon. Athens has become, in Aeschylus' words, a place where gods and mortals meet. The dramatist's piety is in his fear and respect for the holiness of divine power, and in his sense of the redeeming grace from above, which is bestowed on Orestes, guilty and hunted though he is. Aeschylus has no single word for God. Astonishingly, he knows this. Early in the Agamemnon, the first play of the trilogy, the chorus says, or more likely sings, "Zeus, great nameless all in all. If that name will gain his favour, I will call him Zeus." 900 years later, it's easy to forget how long the classical world lasted. St. Augustine wrote, "Now although God alone is thought of as the God of gods, he is also thought of by those who imagine, invoke, and worship other gods, insofar as their thinking strives to reach a being than which there is nothing better or more exalted." A striking little prevision of Anselm's ontological proof, that remark. Prometheus Bound is probably the first play of a trilogy, the rest of which is lost. In it, the central figure, whose name means forethought or wisdom, is nailed to a rock in a cruel scene no Christian can watch without being reminded of the crucifixion. In one legend, Prometheus had created of clay the first man and the first woman. Now he's been punished by Zeus, father of the gods, for his love for the human race, which Zeus, despairing of humanity, had resolved to destroy. This purpose, Prometheus says, there was no one to oppose but I. I dared. I saved the human race from being ground to dust, from total death. For that I am subjected to this bitter pain, agony to endure, heartrending to behold. There's a faint promise in the play that one day Prometheus, who is mysteriously Zeus's own wisdom, will be reconciled with the father of the gods. Throughout, the underlying theme is that divine justice will prevail, and that only through suffering, presented as both an offering and a spectacle to the divine powers, and for the audience, will recognition of the truth be reached. See what things I, a god, suffer from the gods, Prometheus cries, to heaven and earth when he's alone. The word pasco, suffer, echoes through the play. So does the prayer to be seen. Tragedy is above all, in every sense of above all, the spectacle of suffering. The one who suffers, who carries his own sin, and often the sin of others, held up so that heaven and the watching people can see him. In the play's last lines, Prometheus pleads, O firmament turning the light common to all, see the justice I suffer, or see the injustice I suffer. The Greek word will do both. In Sophocles' Theban plays, not a trilogy because written at different periods of his life, Antigone first, then Oedipus the king, then Oedipus at Colonus, we again watch justice suffered. We watch human beings in another doomed family, Antigone and Creon, and above all Oedipus himself, suffer into the dawning knowledge of sin, guilt, and sacrifice. In Oedipus at Colonus, the last Greek tragedy we have, there's a promise of blessing for the blind and exiled king, deeply guilty and deeply penitent, and for those among whom we see him. Oedipus's burden of sin and suffering is, he tells the chorus, something received as a gift, a prize to break the heart. When Theseus, king of Athens, asks the old beggar why he has come, Oedipus replies, I come with a gift for you, my own shattered body, no feast for the eyes, but the gains it holds are greater than great beauty. When, Theseus asks, will the gift you offer come to light? When I am dead, Oedipus says, and you have put my body in the grave. And as he leaves the stage to die, the chorus sings, numberless agonies, blind and senseless, came his way in life. Now let a just God grant him glory. You really can translate those lines like that. The grammar will do it. The post-Nietzschean secular view of the parallels and premonitions of these plays, in relation to the drama that is at the center of Christianity, is that all religion is primitive, that pagan victims of fate, such as Agamemnon and his family, Oedipus and his, or Prometheus, are bound to resemble other suffering heroes of myth, such as those in the Old Testament, David above all, chosen and punished by God. And the story of Jesus told in the New Testament, his cruel death and return to life, is in this view unsurprisingly like the story of Dionysus, god of passion, death, excess, who was recalled as killed and returned to life in the Athenian festival in which the tragedies were performed. At the heart of the festival was the sacrifice of a male animal, a goat or a lamb, a ceremony not unlike the expiatory sacrifices of male animals enjoined on Aaron in Leviticus, and the sending into the wilderness of the goat, the scapegoat, who takes away the sins of Israel. In this view, myths are stories made up in pre-scientific societies to explain an inexplicable world and to console people for its miseries. And myths, in turn, inform rituals undertaken to placate whatever forces rule this world. So, no wonder Christianity has much in common with other myths and rituals, even to the display, recollection, and representation of the sacrificial victim of divine justice, through whose death comes atonement for sin. The root meaning of the Greek word theatre is a place for seeing. A church is, among other things, a place for seeing. If there is not, and never has been God, for Nietzsche's Death of God, of course, proclaims that God has always been a myth, and if Christianity is only one more myth, and one more set of rituals, then neither tragic drama nor the ceremonies of Judaism and Christianity have any meaning beyond their expression of human misery and human hope in a meaningless universe. If no horizon of God's justice and mercy stands behind our suffering and death, then tragedy can be nothing other than a paradoxically exhilarating howl of despair. If, on the other hand, the truth, goodness, and beauty of God are revealed in Christ, and there is profound meaning in Christian rituals, particularly in the Eucharist, then Greek tragedy becomes a foreshadowing, an analogy. Its relative but real meaning would not become evident until God, in Christ, became, in the drama of the days from Maundy Thursday to Easter Sunday, the embodiment of suffering and redemption, sacrifice and atonement. That is, in every Eucharist, not a metaphor and not a play. To put this differently, if the only glory is the glory of God, then what we can in its light perceive as the contingent glory in what has been made by human beings returns to a describable meaning. It then becomes possible to see Greek tragic heroes as victims of sin and cruelty, guilty as Christ was not, but sharing in the scapegoat desolation of his sacrificial death. And also to see them as representing in their particular characters and destinies the special fate, the special guilt and self-recognition and possible redemption of each of us. In the words of Nicholas Boyle in his book Sacred and Secular Scriptures, great works of literature may, quote, have at their heart a principled universality which fits them to participate symbolically in that interaction of law and loss and reconciliation which Christians call atonement or redemption. One theologian explored this analogy to its very depth. Having discussed the beauty of God with tremendous power in the 7 volumes of The Glory of the Lord, Balthasar turned to the goodness of God in the 5 volumes of Theodrama. Here he wants us to understand the action of God in his revelation in Christ as the drama which gives meaning to human life and discloses as its horizon and end the judgment of God. God is author, that is, creator and father. God is actor, that is, son, image, character, the Greek word used in the first chapter of Hebrews. He is the reflection of God's glory and bears the character of God's own being. And God is director, the guiding spirit of the drama as it is played. Using Greek tragedy as his pattern from the outset, Balthasar calls drama a representation of existence in its meaning and in its covert meaning. In the Greek tragedies, the suffering man is lifted up like a monstrance and shown to the gods, who, though invisible, are watching. That's a remarkable sentence. He doesn't forget who else is watching. We are. In a resonant evocation of the Old Testament, He says later in this first volume of Theodrama, quote, "The author, with his shaping role, stands at the beginning of the whole production triad and ensures that it has an effect beyond itself on the audience. That audience which the author has envisaged right from the start, and with whom, over the heads of the actor and director, he has established an understanding." If the suffering central figure in a Greek tragedy is lifted up like a monstrance before and for the audience in the theatre, as Moses lifted up the serpent before and for the Israelites, and alternately as the crucified Christ is lifted up before and for us all, then again, in Balthasar's words, the drama of Christ is the recapitulation and the end of Greek tragedy. The tragic dimension of personal existence is not softened. In fact, it is wrenched apart to the very limit in the cross. Balthasar here has not only used Greek tragedy to give us new insight into the unique central drama of Christian revelation, he's also provided us with new possibilities for understanding the impact on us of tragic drama written in the Christian period. Shakespeare knew nothing of Aeschylus and Sophocles, nor, thank goodness, did he know Aristotle's brilliant analysis in the Poetics, which some in early modern Europe, particularly in France, took to be the rule book for attempting to write tragedy at all. Shakespeare felt his way towards tragedy through writing history plays, as genres that scarcely existed when he began to write them, though the Renaissance recognized the tragic in stories of the downfall of people of prominence and power. The doomed family, riven by cruelty and revenge, the prominent victim of sin and fate, or of his own guilt, whose death may bring some grace, some healing to a fractured society. The anguish suffered as a long-stifled conscience turns to self-knowledge. The overconfidence that blinds the soul to truth. Shakespeare found all of these in the chronicles of English and Roman history. Henry VI and Richard III, Richard II and Henry IV. There are elements of the tragic in all four, as there are in Julius Caesar and Brutus, though none is yet a properly tragic hero. In his four great tragedies, each quite different from the others in setting, atmosphere and language, and above all in the particularity of the central character, Shakespeare was able, like Aeschylus and Sophocles 2,000 years before, to hold a suffering man before us, as guilty and innocent, as actor and victim, agent and patient, to be judged, though not by us, against the transcendent horizon. From what Shakespeare had so far achieved, and from the writing going on in the theatre at the time, no one could have predicted Hamlet, the play, or, above all, Hamlet, the character. This young man, intelligent, thoughtful, brave, his head buzzing with the new ideas current in the London of 1600, but his heart held in the ancient structure of Catholic piety, becomes a tragic hero not because he's committed a grave sin or blundered into a dreadful error. He becomes a tragic hero by being born into the common human condition, the tangle of sin and sinfulness in which every human being has to live. Use every man after his desert, and who shall escape whipping, he says to Polonius at an unspectacular moment in the play. The story in which he has to live and die has its own original sin, but it isn't Hamlet's. His uncle and his mother are to blame for the rottenness in the state of Denmark, which he discovers it's his responsibility to purge. This is a role, brilliant role player though he is. He finds himself totally unfitted to play. Like Laertes and Ophelia, children of the other father in the play, he is dragged into and eventually killed by the will to power, the lies, lust, deceit and self-deceit of the older generation. Unlike Laertes, an avenger without qualms, and Ophelia, a guileless victim of the sins of others, including Hamlet, he takes on and suffers the burden of knowledge, of sinful mortality shared and understood. Struggling against it, he lashes out, articulate and brilliant, with biting words at Cecilia, Polonius, his mother, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Claudius, his real enemy. By mistake, he kills Polonius. Deliberately, he sends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to the death Claudius has arranged for him. But Hamlet, lifted up by Shakespeare to be shown in his injuries, his guilt and his pain, to us and to God, at last finds in himself the courage and faith to face death with calm freedom. There is a special providence in the fall of the sparrow. If it be now, 'tis not to come. If it be not to come, it will be now. If it be not now, yet it will come. The words echo those of the only brave peasant to be conscripted by Falstaff in Henry IV, Part 2. No one who's seen the play can help having his or her understanding of what it is to be alive, to suffer and to die against the horizon of God deepened and strengthened. The same is true of Othello, a figure who differs from Hamlet in almost every respect, except that he also has to learn truth through suffering. Othello is no intellectual. He's a middle-aged African general of great reputation in military skill, hired by the wealthy, complacent city of Venice to fight its wars against the Ottomans. His love for his bride Desdemona, the daughter of a Venetian patrician who entertained Othello in his house but now regards him as a barbarian magician, is passionate, delighted, awed, to a keen observer, fragile and vulnerable. The keen observer is Iago. Ambitious, resentful, devious and very clever, Iago is a moral relativist. Virtue, he says, a fig, 'tis in ourselves that we are thus or thus. He's out for his private ends and contemptuous of all that is good and generous, all that connects one human being to another in love and loyalty. Othello and Desdemona and others in the drama are easy prey to his gleeful, opportunistic malice. It's deeply painful to watch the destruction of Othello at the hands of someone he's trusted for years and who knows him so much better than he knows himself. An outsider, both needed and despised by Venice, like Shylock in Shakespeare's other Venetian play, Othello regains the nobility carefully established in the first act at the very end of the play, when he understands the truth, not only about Iago and Desdemona, but about himself. When we shall meet at Count, he says to the faithful wife he's just killed, this look of thine will hurl my soul from heaven, and fiends will snatch at it. The fiends in the shape of Iago already have, but in his horrified penitence and his turning of his last weapon on himself as the foreigner who failed to recognize the treasure he'd been given, one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away, richer than all his tribe, we, watching, feel that his soul has escaped the fiends, that in the final judgment there may be mercy for Othello. Macbeth is the Shakespearean tragic hero who enters the drama of his suffering into truth with the most evidently formed Christian conscience. When he kills Duncan, he knows exactly what he's doing, exactly what he's done. Tortured by guilt, he plunges into more murder, killing people at an increasing distance, and in the rest of the play, alone with the truth, his wife loses her reason to avoid recognizing. He finds himself in hell. He finds himself in hell. These 5 words are precise. He knows hell for what it is, the place of absolute distance from God, of absolute meaninglessness, signifying nothing in the phrase I quoted earlier. And he knows that he's chosen to be in this place. This is what sets Macbeth before us and for us as a tragic hero. If against the divine horizon there's a glimmer of hope for him in the darkness into which we have accompanied him through the play, It's in his acknowledgement all the way of the truth. After his first step into evil, he pretended to be surprised at the sight of the slaughtered Duncan. But his words were true. Had I but died an hour before this chance, I had lived a blessed time. And he knows, as we do, that it isn't chance but choice that has taken him to where he is. He was free to choose, and he chose. Shakespeare's greatest tragedy, his most profound exploration of how things are between human beings and between the soul and God, and his most searching presentation of a man who learns truth through suffering, is King Lear. The play was written in the year between Othello and Macbeth. It's still absolutely astonishing that anyone could have produced those three plays in a couple of years. In King Lear, as so often in Shakespeare, every failure is a failure of love. Both old men, Lear and Gloucester, misplaced their trust in children who despised them, as Othello misplaced his trust in Iago. With scorn for what is good, noble and generous, Goneril, Regan and Edmund, like Iago, like Lady Macbeth, are pursuing only their own selfish and greedy ends in a jungle of competitive will to power, which Shakespeare everywhere regards as a new and Machiavellian set of values, according to which hypocritical self-presentation and manipulation of others are the means to solitary success, solitary moral disaster. That the pursuit of success through the stifling of the conscience leads to disaster is itself a statement of faith in the conscience as a real connection between the soul and God. As dear Mackinnon wrote in The Problem of Metaphysics, one is often reminded that if a man thinks to defy the law of gravity in walking over the edge of a cliff, he merely continues to illustrate it. Moral laws, on the other hand, are often disregarded. But there is something strange in their disregard, and that if it is fundamental, it is a self-destruction. Shakespeare always knew this. I am myself alone. Richard III, still Duke of York, says in Henry VI, Part 3, Shakespeare's second play, plotting his brother's murder. This is everywhere in Shakespeare, the libido dominandi, identified by St. Augustine as the motive force of the civitas terrena. Self-love, reaching the point of contempt for God. As Professor Novak said yesterday, the person and the community should be defined in terms of each other, so that every triumph in Lear is a triumph of love, a triumph of reconnection of the person and community. Cordelia and Edgar forgive their fathers for the wrongs they suffered long before Lear and Gloucester recognise or repent what they've done. So does Kent, whose loyalty to his old master shines through the play as the strongest of many examples of the faithful bond between servant and master that Shakespeare valued almost as highly as the bonds of marriage and family. Coleridge wrote, Kent is perhaps the nearest to perfect goodness in all Shakespeare's characters. Virtue itself seems to be in company with him. Meanwhile, we watch Lear and Gloucester suffer most terribly on their paths to self-knowledge. Slowly and agonizingly, each of them is brought to a true understanding of what he's done and what has been done to him. Gloucester, through the machinations of Edmund, is blinded in a scene of sadistic cruelty and then rescued from suicide by Edgar. Lear, through madness and the dereliction of being shut out on the stormy heath, comes to understand at a deeper level than Gloucester's capable of, not only what he's done to Cordelia, but how he has lived as king, blind to injustice and the miseries of the defenceless poor for whom he was responsible. Sight through blindness, understanding through madness. The two old men suffer separately, until observed only by Edgar they meet in a scene the poignancy of which even Shakespeare never exceeded. Lear, with an acuteness of perception that is crazy only in the violence of its expression, excoriates the lust that was Gloucester's sin, and the careless exercise of authority that was his own. They recognize each other. The warmth between them is their common suffering of the fallenness of a sinful world. When we are born, we cry that we are come to this great stage of fools, Lear says. And then, hitting the stage she's sitting on, this is a good block. A stage to perform on, to be watched on, to suffer on, to be held up on. A block is also a scaffold. There's no moment in theatre like this one until Vladimir, in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, says to his old friend and companion in suffering and in patience, astride of a grave and a difficult birth, down in the hole lingeringly the grave digger puts on the forceps. We have time to grow old. The air is full of our cries. These two old men are also, in their sometimes comic, always offbeat way, tragic heroes. Do you think God sees me? Estragon cries to Vladimir. And when at the end of each act a boy appears to say that Godot won't come this evening, but surely tomorrow, Vladimir says, tell him you saw us. When Lear wakes from madness to find loving, reproachless Cordelia at his side, he sees her as Othello sees Desdemona in heaven, while he is punished. Thou art a soul in bliss, but I am bound upon a wheel of fire, that mine own tears do scald like molten lead. Having lost the military but not the transcendental battle to Goneril, Regan and Edmund, Lear and Cordelia go happily to prison, free of the world's will to power, as if we were God's spies. But the watching audience has to bear one more blow inflicted on the old king. He reappears with the body of Cordelia, hanged on Edmund's orders, and soon himself dies, incoherent again, not knowing Kent, who has never deserted him. Pray you, undo this button. Thank you, sir. Only if the divine horizon of God's justice and mercy is felt as absent rather than present, can the deaths of Cordelia and Lear be thought to cancel the goodness and truth and beauty of them both, one through suffering and through grace. Balthazar's sentence on the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles is even more true of King Lear. However great the tragedy, it takes place before the face of God. The hero's ethos is to bear well what is laid upon him. The quotations from Oedipus at Colonus, in which another broken old king is helped by his devoted daughter to a death which is a blessing. Shakespeare, unlike Dante, doesn't himself judge. It's not in this life that goodness is rewarded, although wickedness may be punished in the knowledge of distance from God, that is Macbeth, or in the nihilist deserts in which Iago survives his play. Towards the end of Lear, Goneril's weak, well-meaning husband Albany says, hoping to set things right, all friends shall taste the wages of their virtue, and all foes the cup of their deservings. Such bland sententiousness is no more than words in the face of death, which removes justice beyond human reckoning to the kingdom of God. Shakespeare knew this. The drama of all his plays, even of the dark and bitter Troilus and Cressida and Measure for Measure, is acted out against the divine horizon of the judgment, the final judgment of God. It's not necessary for Shakespeare to have his characters say that this is so, although interestingly, in each of those almost despairing plays, one shaft of light is shed by one character. In Troilus, which dramatizes moral relativism and the will to power let rip, Hector says, but value dwells not in particular will. It holds his estimate and dignity as well wherein 'tis precious of itself, as in the prizer. and Isabella in Measure for Measure, before she's tangled in the lies of the Duke's heartless plotting. This is a play, by the way, if you've read the book, that Balthazar gets completely wrong. It's one of his very few complete lapses. I think he couldn't deal with it in English. Isabella says to the devious judge, Angelo, why all the souls that were forfeit once, and he that might advantage best have took, found out the remedy. How would you be if he wishes the top of judgment should but judge you as you are? This is the question tragedy asks of its central characters, and through them of us all. Too long. Only a little bit more. Another writer. One of the greatest of all writers of tragedy was a novelist. Dostoevsky's 19th century Russia was, you might think, very different from Shakespeare's England. Having joined the history of Europe late, Russian intellectuals were bound to look at the Christian past of the West through the eyes of the Enlightenment. By the time Dostoevsky was writing his major novels in the 1860s and 70s, all the secular Western ideas of the moment, materialism, positivism, utilitarianism, utopian socialism, revolutionary anarchism, each explicitly or implicitly atheist, were competing for attention in Russia, and its own Orthodox Church, run as a Department of State since Peter the Great, was regarded by most Russians abreast of modern thought as a backward-looking refuge for superstitious peasants. All this seemed worlds away from Shakespeare's time and place, but Dostoevsky and Shakespeare nevertheless have a great deal in common. Shakespeare, Dostoevsky wrote in his notebook in the 1870s, is a prophet sent by God to proclaim to us the mystery of man and of the human soul. Dostoevsky shared Nietzsche's sense of the consuming importance of the question of whether or not there is a transcendent horizon. Berdyaev, in his book about Dostoevsky, written in France in the ominous year 1932, wrote, "The thing which Dostoevsky and Nietzsche knew is that man is terribly free, that liberty is tragic and a grievous burden to him. They had seen the parting of the ways in front of mankind. The road of liberty can only end either in the deification of man or in the discovery of God. In the one case he is lost and done for, in the other he finds salvation." Dostoevsky understood before Nietzsche had written anything the scale of the difference between a world made and given meaning by God and a world in which human projects that may or may not be achievable contend for power, and in which virtue is replaced by domination and manipulation of others. As Shakespeare demonstrates, other people are either ends or means. Hobbes was Shakespeare's younger contemporary, as Nietzsche was Dostoevsky's. Alistair MacIntyre wrote that without some genuine knowledge of that perfect goodness in relationship to which alone the soul finds ultimate good, the soul would surely become a Hobbesian soul. Concluding both, this is a quote from Hobbes, comes next, "There is not such finis ultimus, nor summum bonum, as is spoken of in the books of the old moral philosophers, but a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceases only in death." Human life in these circumstances becomes, in Hobbes' most famous phrase, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short. And as MacIntyre says in the same book, what for the kind of ancient and medieval moral inquiry and practice which Thomism embodied was the exceptional condition of the deprived and isolated individual, became for modernity the condition of the human being as such. This modernity is Dostoevsky's world. Again, in the terms used by Professor Novak yesterday, the individual replaces the person, and the difference is absolutely critical. It's clearly impossible here to to explore in any detail very long, very complex and very subtle novels. Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, after the double murder he commits in a Nietzschean spirit of transgressive freedom, struggles for the rest of the novel towards truth, penitence and grace, and a sense of his connectedness to the rest of the human race. In The Devils, a terrifying book, and an astonishingly accurate prediction of the fate that was in store for Russia 40 years later, there's a powerful understanding between author and audience, here the reader, that sustains the transcendent horizon, the sense of the judgment of God, while the darkness of the story is lit by only the occasional glimpse of human goodness. The central figure, Stavrogy, is a cold, careless destroyer of people's lives, more chilling than any character in Shakespeare. He suffers precisely, in Hobbes's words, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power. He's played with each radical idea of the day and has no commitment to anything or anyone. The revolutionary cell of his disparate admirers implodes in murder. His henchman alone survives, the Iago of the novel, who is a manipulative liar, driven by malice, by admiration for and hatred of Stavrogy, and by sheer enjoyment of power over others. In The Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's last and greatest book, we live and suffer with and watch, as in a theatre of the soul, the four sons of old Karamazov, a monster of lust, greed, and above all contempt. Contempt. Hamlet opposes the word scorn to the word virtue when he's talking about the theatre. Who is murdered by one of them. Three of them want him dead. One of them kills him, and we don't discover which for hundreds and hundreds of pages. Although one, the clever, anguished, undecided atheist, Ivan, comes close to hell, and another, the monk Alyosha, has occasional glimpses of heaven, the judgment is always beyond the story, always God's. The brothers live, as we all do, in the temporal world, where things change, where learning can be done or not, where God can be responded to or turned away from, where sin is committed, but also where its purgation can at least begin. We see Alyosha, good, peacemaking, gentle, go through and recover from a despairing crisis of faith. We see Ivan returning his ticket to a God who allows the cruelty of unpunished human beings. But Ivan is agonized in his atheism, agonized by his own premonition in the legend of the Grand Inquisitor of the horrifying unfreedom of what will eventually be Stalin's Russia, and agonized to insanity by his own manipulation of his loutish, illegitimate brother. As he loses his grip on reality, Ivan is visited by the devil, a down-at-heel apparition who talks like Nietzsche. This is the devil speaking. Since there is neither God nor immortality anyway, the new man has a right to become a man-god, though he may be the only one in the whole world. And he may light-heartedly jump over every barrier of the old moral code of the former man-slave, if he deems it necessary. And then there is Mitya, the eldest brother, as unloved as Edmund in Lear, passionate, impulsive, succumbing to the temptations that beset Dostoevsky himself for much of his life, but condemned to a Siberian prison for the parricide he has not committed. Near the beginning of the novel, Alyosha's beloved elder, Father Zosima, in whose monastic cell and through whose eyes we first meet the Karamazovs, prostrates himself before Mitya. Hundreds of pages later, on the next day, the elder explains to Alyosha that he had seen in Mitya's face the great suffering that is in store for him. After the murder and his hectic flight through a tangle of passion, fury, money, violence, Mitya, hunted and desperate, like Lear in his madness, reaches, like Lear, a sense of solidarity with the poor of the earth, through a dream of desolation, from which he wakes to find that a stranger has put a pillow under his head. He then, through his wonderfully written trial, divines truthful but crazed evidence, other perjured evidence, the speeches of clever lawyers certain of his guilt, and the verdict of a peasant jury pleased to convict a gentleman. He accepts the injustice of his sentence, as Lear accepts his and Cordelia's. Upon such sacrifices, my Cordelia, the gods themselves throw incense. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, in his recent book about Dostoevsky, writes that Dostoevsky challenges the reader to explain exactly what the truth, outside or without Christ, would be, and stakes the claim that truth about the human world is not going to be possible if faith is removed from the equation. Close quote. Dostoevsky compels us to understand that we may acknowledge or not our dependence on God. We have the freedom to respond or not to his gift of grace. But if we deny our dependence and deny the existence of grace, in Williams's words, we are faced with the unanswerable question of why any one policy for living is preferable to any other. This is what Donald MacKinnon meant when he suggested that in tragedy we reach a form of representation that by the very ruthlessness of its interrogation enables us to project, as does no available alternative, our ultimate question. The sacrifice of Mitya Karamazov, like the sacrifice of Oedipus and Antigone, of Lear and Cordelia, and of Hamlet, Othello, and Macbeth accepting death, is the central act of a tragedy, an act of expiation for the sins of the family, the time, the place. All are figures in plays, stories, fiction, but all have the meaning they have as shadows or reflections of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, the central divine act of expiation for the sins of the world. The tragic writers hold up before us and for us characters whom we see against the horizon of the judgment that is finally and only the judgment of God. The plays are for anyone, anywhere to watch, the novels for anyone to read. They are fiction, but they share in the truth of God, which St. Augustine said in the Confession, doesn't belong to me, nor to anyone else, but to us all. In Balthasar's words, truth is the unconcealment of being, while the notion of this unconcealment requires someone to whom it is unconcealed. This someone is God. Great tragedy, properly understood, though always partial and imperfect, as are all things created by human beings, is a major achievement in the unconcealment of being. Any attempt to discover, insofar as limited mortals can, what is God's view of reality and the human condition. And that last phrase is a recent definition in a book about the Pope of theology itself. Thank you.
We have a little time for questions, about 12, 13 minutes. So, would anybody like to make a question or comment?
Yes, thank you very much for this wonderful trip through wonderful literature. And of course, I'm totally at peace with the vision which you gave. If there is no transcendent horizon, there is no meaning to anything. The only question I have concerns the concept of the foreshadowing, because it seems to me that that which is foreshadowed in these scenes which you have described with respect to Christ's sacrifice is only a very thin sliver of what Christ did. I mean, the whole dimension of Christ's trampling death by death and resurrecting our flesh and bringing us to the throne of God. That is lacking. What is present is only the idea of a sacrifice in expiation of a divine hostile judgment. So it gives a very limited view of the Christian vision.
Of course. Nobody could possibly have made that interpretation of Greek tragedy, which after all is hundreds of years pre-Christian, unless they were looking at it through the eyes of a Christian person who has taken on board everything you said. On the other hand, these were major religious occasions for the people of Athens. They were not just entertainment. And they were major religious occasions because there is a powerful sense in them that justice will prevail, that somewhere, somehow, order will be restored to a disordered story or a disordered family or a disordered city. And, they didn't have the wherewithal to go any further than that. But the reason that those tragedies continue to be so moving is, I think, that behind them lies a kind of human instinct for divine justice and for the purging of sin through suffering.
It's just that it looks a little bit Pharisaian too, doesn't it?
Well, it's, this is a long time ago, and how can it not?
Anybody else?
Not a question, just try to convey some different vision from the Chinese literature. Have you read about...
I'm sorry to say I know absolutely nothing about Chinese literature. Do go on.
Yeah, there's a book called The Dream of Red Chambers, which is a classic in Chinese and has a lot of translations. I think it has translation in English. And that book talks about tragedy between two young guys, a young man and a young woman, their cousins, and that book tries to talk about the tragedy from a Buddhist point of view. And according to that point of view, the tragedy happens because they don't understand. They don't get enlightened from the Buddhist perspective.
That might well be a parallel. Though I do think that the very young can't be, strictly speaking, tragic. Romeo and Juliet is called a tragedy, but, they're children, really, aren't they? It's a story that, of course, ends in death and disaster, and maybe the parallel one does in the book you're talking about, but they haven't grown up enough to be capable of tragedy, those two. It's just a terrible story, but it does, of course, have the element of the sins of the fathers being responsible for the fate of the children. How's that? But that's very interesting, and I'm afraid I don't know at all about the book, but probably I ought to read it.
Well, I think it has a lot of about, it wants a lot about how you perceive the world, especially the metaphysics. For the Buddhists, human beings not only have the life, but also have a past life. And most of the tragic things contribute from the past life. I think that's
That's very interesting.
Anybody else?
Can you comment on how your themes today relates to your larger book? Is that a part of the larger book? Is that a theme of your larger book? Or just how it relates?
Well, yes. I have, in this book, there are chapters about Greek tragedy, at the very beginning, and then a lot of other things in between, and then eventually there's quite a lot about Shakespeare, and eventually, again, a lot of other things in between, quite a lot about Dostoevsky. But the book is not about tragedy. I've today tried to stick to one particular form, although I know that it's disputable that a novel can be a tragedy, but I'm quite sure that Dostoevsky's novels are tragedies, and some of Conrad's are too, and there are others. There are more obvious tragic novels. Hardy, for example, The Mayor of Casterbridge is a tragic novel. It doesn't sort of quite make it up to these dizzy heights, I don't think. But it's got a tragic form, clearly. But yes, the book has a good deal more about all these things. But it struck me that because we're here to be thinking about the person and the common good and the what connects people and what divides people and all that, virtue and sacrifice, particularly perhaps sacrifice, that this would be a good topic to talk about in this conference.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Lucy, I'd like to ask you, you quoted Balthasar. Could you just say a little bit about how his work has kind of influenced this whole kind of new Christian appreciation of literature as a avenue into theology?
Well, I guess I could. I don't know. I sort of ran into Balthasar kind of almost by myself, which is really how I've done everything. I forced a lot of monks at Aberforth to read Balthasar, and they all said he's too long, which I thought was pretty hopeless. One or two of them have read that. I just think he's wonderful. I love reading his stuff. He's been extremely well translated by teams of people for the Ignatius Press. I have tried to read him in German, but my German is not up to reading Balthasar in German, but the translations are very, very good. And it is massive, but there's a most interesting, sympathetic, warm, highly intelligent mind working all the time. And reading Balthasar in that kind of way is a little bit like reading Augustine himself. You feel him thinking as he's writing, which is very exciting. And he, particularly in The Glory of the Lord, he has done a huge amount to bring back together literary study and theology as an enterprise, which, you know, badly needed doing. Because of something we've been hearing about in several of the presentations I've listened to in the last couple of days, this kind of whizzing off into different worlds, the departments and specialties and different disciplines do, is just very sad. And to bring various things together under a kind of umbrella sense of providence and God's direction of the world and the all searches for truth being convergent rather than disparate. This is something that Balthasar makes a huge contribution to, I think.
Is there, for someone who's just starting out to read Balthasar, would you recommend which should come first, The Glory of the Lord or The Fear of God?
Ooh, I mean, The Glory of the Lord is, you know, we're talking shelves of books. If somebody's just starting, I would actually recommend one or two little tiny books, always quite comforting to read a very short book. My Work in Retrospect is his view. It's a bit like Augustine's Retractationis at the end of his life. He's looking back at everything he did and what it meant at the time. That's quite a good one to begin with. It's called My Work in Retrospect. Or absolutely wonderful Lent book is Mysterium Pascale, which is by Easter, which is just about the Triduum. It's not a huge book. It's, I don't know, 200 pages long. It's not a really daunting, horrifying book, but it's a wonderful, wonderful book. If you want to embark on The Glory of the Lord, there's really no substitute for starting on page 1 of volume 1 and seeing how you go. But after that, you can read some volumes and not other volumes. The ones not to miss, interestingly, So you've sort of earned them by the time you've got through 5 other volumes, and the last 2, one on the Old Testament and the last of all on the New Testament. But once you've got used to the way Balthazar's mind works, there's a huge amount to be gained from the last 2 of those books in the Glory of the Lord. Fear Drama is slightly more patchy, I think, but some of it is absolutely brilliant. The last volume, that's only 5 volumes. You need some time to do all this. And then the third part of his huge great trilogy, we had beauty and we had goodness and then we had truth. The last part is called Theologic. And the first volume of that he wrote before any of the other volumes of all the others. It's brilliant stuff. But you have to pull yourself together and be prepared to work. But they're great books, and he was a very great man.
Maybe we need to have a whole other conference on this Balthazar.
Or several.
Or several, right. Okay, I think we're just about out of time, so we'd like to thank